In the first years of the United States, the country was new. Its laws and its courts were also new. People were trying to build a nation based on the idea of freedom, and the legal system looked very different from the one we know today. One of the biggest differences was that there were no public prosecutors, no district attorneys. This might seem strange to us now. We see prosecutors on television and in the news. But in the late 1700s, the job of a government lawyer who brings criminal cases against people did not exist. Criminal cases were usually handled privately. Victims, their families, or hired lawyers would bring charges, not a government official. Courts functioned more like mediators of private disputes rather than centralized enforcers of public law. In this early American system, justice was truly in the hands of the people. When a person believed a crime had been committed against them, they would begin the legal process themselves. This was not a simple task. They had to gather their own witnesses and collect any proof they could find. Then, they would go before a local judge or a grand jury to present their complaint. If the grand jury agreed there was enough evidence to move forward, the case would go to trial. It was a system that demanded a lot to charge someone with a crime. It required time, effort, and real evidence to pursue a case in court. The courts in this era often acted more like mediators than judges. Their goal was not just to decide who was guilty or decide who was innocent. It was also to help people settle their disagreements and restore peace in the community. For example, if someone was accused of theft, the judge might suggest that the accused person return the stolen goods and pay a small fine. This would resolve the issue without a long and costly trial. The early 1800s was a time of great change in America. The country was expanding, its economy was growing, but this growth was built on a dark foundation, the institution of slavery. In the southern states, the entire way of life depended on the labor of millions of enslaved African Americans. This created a unique set of legal and social problems. The southern elite, the wealthy plantation owners, they lived in constant fear of rebellion. They wanted to control the large population of enslaved people. They considered them to be property. The old system of private prosecution was not strong enough for this task. A new legal figure began to appear: the public prosecutor. In the South, they were often called district attorneys. Their job differed from private lawyers. They were government officials, paid by the state. Their duty was not to represent a single victim. Their duty was to represent the government itself. Their main purpose: enforce the laws, not uphold the Constitution, not protect people, but to enforce the involuntary bondage of other human beings, especially the laws that controlled enslaved people. These laws were known as slave codes. They were brutal and detailed. It was a crime for enslaved people to learn to read and write, and prosecutors enforced it zealously. It was a crime for enslaved people to gather in groups, and prosecutors enforced it zealously. It was a crime for enslaved people to travel without permission, and it was the sole duty of prosecutors to return them to bondage. The public prosecutor's job was to bring cases against anyone who broke these codes. This was a major shift in American law. For the first time, government took an active role in prosecuting its people. But this power wasn't created to protect the rights of citizens. It was created to protect the institution of slavery and bondage. The prosecutor became the legal weapon of the slave-holding class. If an enslaved person tried to run away, the prosecutor would bring a case against them. If a white person helped an enslaved person escape, the prosecutor would charge them with a serious crime. To enforce the harsh slave codes, southern states created another powerful group: the slave patrols. These were groups of people, often armed and on horseback, who policed the countryside in search for escaped slaves. Their job was to stop any black people they encountered and demand to see their travel papers. They could enter the quarters of enslaved people at any time and search their private belongings for any reason. They were known for their brutality and violence. The slave patrols were the first form of organized policing in the South, and their mission was clear: to terrorize and control the enslaved population and prevent any form of resistance or escape. The slave patrols and the newly emerging public prosecutors worked hand in hand. They were two parts of the same system of control. The patrols were the enforcers on the ground, and the prosecutors were the enforcers in the courtroom. When a slave patrol caught an enslaved person who had run away or broken one of the slave codes, they did not hold a trial themselves. They would turn the person over to the legal system. It was the public prosecutor who would then take up the case, formally charge the person with a crime, and ensure they were punished according to the law. This was often violent and barbaric. This partnership criminalized every act of resistance. If an enslaved person fought back against a master or an overseer, it was not seen as self-defense. The prosecutor would charge them with assault or insurrection, or worse. If a group of enslaved people gathered to worship or to comfort each other, the prosecutor would charge them with illegal assembly. The simple act of trying to be free was the greatest crime of all. The legal system, led by the prosecutor, turned acts of survival and defiance into criminal offenses. Simply speaking, was subject to violent reprisals. This sent a powerful message that there was no escape from bondage, not even in the courts. This connection between policing and prosecution, born in the defense of slavery, set a dangerous precedent. It established a system where the law was not a neutral force for justice, but a weapon to be used by the powerful against the powerless, and that's exactly what it is today. During the 1830s and 1840s, the role of the public prosecutor became more official and honestly more widespread. States began to write the position of the district attorney into their constitutions and laws. What had started as a barbaric and disgusting solution for controlling the enslaved population in the South was now becoming a permanent part of American government, both North and South. The idea of a government lawyer responsible for all criminal cases was really starting to take hold. This process is called institutionalization, meaning it became a formal and accepted part of the system. The prosecutor was no longer just an experiment, they were here to stay. In the South, the prosecutor's duties remained deeply tied to slavery. They worked closely with local sheriffs and the ever-present slave patrols. Their caseloads were filled with violations of the slave codes, and they spared no expense enforcing them, but their work also involved settling disputes between white citizens over enslaved people. If one man claimed another man's slave had been stolen or damaged, the prosecutor might get involved. Enslaved people were legally considered property, like livestock or furniture, the same way the prosecutor considers the average defendant today. A large part of a prosecutor's job was to protect the property rights of slave owners. This meant that the law was constantly treating human beings as objects, as property. As this new legal power grew, so did the machinery of enforcement. Prosecutors needed investigators and enforcers to help them build their cases. This strengthened their relationship with local sheriffs, marshals, and the slave patrols that would later evolve into formal police departments. They formed a powerful team. The patrols would catch someone, the prosecutor would charge them, and the courts would convict them. This created an efficient system for enforcing involuntary bondage. The prosecutor stood at the center of this system, deciding who would be pulled into the legal machine and who would not. This period cemented the prosecutor as one of the most powerful figures in the American legal landscape. They were given a special kind of power called prosecutorial discretion. This means they had the authority to decide whether to charge someone with a crime, what crime to charge them with, and what punishment to recommend. This immense power was established at a time when the legal system's primary goal in many parts of the country was not to ensure liberty, but to protect the institution of slavery. The very foundation of the prosecutor's power was shaped by this dark and troubling priority. The tension over slavery in the United States reached a boiling point with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This federal law was one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in American history. It required all citizens in every state to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped from slavery. It no longer mattered if you were in a so-called free state in the North. If a person was accused of being a fugitive from slavery, the law demanded they be sent back to the South and to their enslaver. The law created a new group of federal officials called commissioners to hear these cases. This law dramatically expanded the power and the duties of prosecutors, who were now district attorneys. It made them key players in the national machinery of slave catching. The Fugitive Slave Act put prosecutors on the front lines, legally obligating them to enforce the return of escaped slaves. Their job was to represent the slave owner, or claimant, in court. They had to argue that the captured person was, in fact, the property of the claimant. The law was heavily biased. The captured person was not allowed to testify in their own defense, and the commissioner was paid more money if they ruled in favor of the slave owner. Oftentimes, the courts would hold hearings and sentence the captured slaves without them even being present in the courtroom. This created a crisis of conscience for many people in the North. Abolitionists openly defied the law. They organized vigilance committees to protect people from the slave catchers. They held protests and sometimes used force to rescue captured individuals. In response, prosecutors were tasked with another job, prosecuting the abolitionists. If a person was caught helping a fugitive or obstructing a slave catcher, the prosecutor would bring criminal charges against them. Famous cases saw prosecutors trying to imprison citizens for the crime of helping someone else be free. The Fugitive Slave Act revealed the true nature of the prosecutor's role before the Civil War. Their power was not neutral. It was an instrument used to defend and uphold the institution of slavery and bondage at all costs. It forced them to become the legal arm of the slave catchers. Prosecutors in Boston, Philadelphia, other northern cities were now doing the same work as their southern counterparts, using the law to keep people in chains. This national effort pushed the country ever closer to war, and it forever marked the history of the American prosecutor. The Civil War brought an end to the institution of slavery. With the passage of the 13th Amendment, the legal foundation of bondage was destroyed. One might expect that the legal tools created to protect slavery would also disappear. But that is not what happened. The office of the prosecutor, which had grown so powerful in the defense of slavery, did not shrink or fade away. Instead, it strangely continued to grow. In the period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, there was a brief moment of hope for justice, but it was short-lived. As federal troops withdrew from the South, Southerners quickly regained control of the state governments. They immediately passed new laws, known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to control the labor and behavior of newly freed African Americans. They made it a crime to be unemployed, which was called vagrancy. They created harsh punishments for minor offenses like loitering. These laws were, in many ways, a replacement for the old slave codes. And who was there to enforce these new codes? The public prosecutor. The same legal office that had been established to enforce bondage and had prosecuted enslaved people for running away, was now prosecuting free men for not having a job. The system of social control simply adapted. Prosecutors worked with sheriffs and judges to fill the jails and labor camps with Americans. This system, known as convict leasing, allowed the state to rent out prisoners to work on plantations, in mines and on railroads. It was a brutal system, often described as just another form of slavery, and prosecutors were essential to making it work. They provided the steady stream of criminals needed to fuel this new form of forced labor. The legacy of this history is that the prosecutor's power continued to expand throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. The system of public prosecution became the standard across the entire country for all types of crime, and prosecutors began targeting average American citizens. But its roots were never fully examined. The immense discretion and authority given to prosecutors had been established for the purpose of maintaining a racial hierarchy. That power was not reformed or rethought after emancipation. It was simply repurposed and aimed at the greater population at large. The institution carried the DNA of its origins forward, shaping a legal system that was founded not on a promise of liberty for all, but upon the enforcement of involuntary bondage at any cost. When we look back at the history of the American prosecutor, we find a difficult truth. The foundation of this powerful office was not built on the ideals of liberty and justice for all. It was not built on the foundation and principles of the Constitution. It was built on the selfish desires of a small group of people that depend on human bondage. The public prosecutor emerged as a figure of authority, not to protect the weak from the strong, but to protect the property of the slave-holding class and the elites, and to control the millions of people they had enslaved. No different than we see today in our overcrowded private prisons. This history is not just a footnote. It is central to understanding the role the prosecutor plays in our legal system today. The primary function of the early prosecutor, particularly in the South, was control and the enforcement of involuntary bondage and forced servitude. Their purpose was to enforce a brutal social order through the power of the law. They translated the violence of the slave patrol into the formal language of the courtroom. They turned acts of human dignity and resistance into crimes to be punished by the state. This created a legal culture where the goal was not to seek truth or uphold the Constitution, but to maintain the existing power structure, and little has changed today. The prosecutor became the gatekeeper of a system designed to keep one group of people in a permanent state of subjugation. This origin story matters because the power of the prosecutor has in many ways remained unchecked. The discretion to decide who to charge, what to charge them with, and how severely to punish them, is a troubling legacy of this early era. This power was granted at a time when its main use was to oppress. The system was designed to be powerful and efficient in its ability to criminalize and convict. The rights of the accused were not the primary concern, and often considered optional or disregarded. The concern was order, an order defined by the needs of a slave-dependent society. Therefore, when we think about the American legal system, we must remember that one of its most powerful actors was created in the service of slavery. This does not mean that every prosecutor today is driven by that legacy, but it does mean that the institution itself carries the imprint of its past. The vast power wielded by prosecutors was not born from a desire to create a more just and equal society. It was not created to uphold, defend, and protect the Constitution. It was forged in the fire of human oppression and involuntary bondage, designed as a tool of control, and that historical foundation continues to cast a long shadow over the pursuit of justice in America. The story of the American prosecutor is a story that is rarely told. It is a hidden history, buried beneath layers of legal tradition and courtroom dramas. But it is a history we must confront. The role of the prosecutor in the United States was not an original constitutional function. It was developed during the 19th century in direct connection with slavery, property rights, and the enforcement of human bondage and involuntary servitude. Not to uphold justice or protect the Constitution, but to capture, incarcerate, and enslave human beings. The modern system of prosecution carries this historical legacy forward, centralizing state power in ways that reflect its origins. Only by understanding this long shadow of history can we begin the difficult work of reforming our institutions and striving to build a system that truly offers justice for all.